Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, where Rob and I dissect the British political landscape. You'll have noticed we have officially rebranded now from Commons People, which is what the podcast used to be called. It's going to be Unparliamentary Language from now on, and all of our social media and so forth has been updated. You can now follow us at Unparl Podcast, because we waited to make a Twitter till after the name change. And Rob, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Oh yeah, I'm a bit tired, but I had a fun weekend, so yeah, I'm pretty good. Shall we rumble right on into our headline quickfire? First, I'm going to put in one that you've actually suggested, which is a bit older. Hit the Chevy with your levy, tax the whiskey and rye.
Yeah, so this is, first of all, this is an amazing headline. I just love it for pure pun reasons. Essentially, the story behind this one is that Donald Trump, has been having a go at China, as he would say, over their trade policy. For a long time, and I think if you remember back to his presidential campaign, he said that the trading with China was unfair and that China had an unfair advantage over the US. So what he's proposed to do is to whack massive tariffs on Chinese steel coming into the US. And what the Chinese would say they would do back, and what they've started to do is they've started to hit back on tariffs on American products, including fruits, nuts, wines, steel pipes, and on 8 other items. Essentially, this could be the beginning of a trade war, which we're not quite sure who's going to come out victorious in that. But all we do know for the moment is that US stocks and shares have been hit pretty severely. They've plunged about 11% since the tariffs were first proposed. So, yeah, it could be a big economic storm that's almost entirely of Trump's own making. So it might be one of the things that opponents of Trump can point to and say, well, that was entirely your doing on how the economy's going at the moment.
And also, might be interesting to see, because of the nature of the setup of the economy in both China and America, they're kind of opposing mentalities, really. So America is a very free market with limited governmental control, whereas in China, like, maybe they can deal with the tariffs because they can just, they can essentially artificially set the prices in China of things, whereas America doesn't have that ability. So perhaps, like, the people who will be affected worse in America, the people who will be affected are probably going to be the workers, not Trump and is it Xi Jinping?
Yes. Yeah.
So they personally probably won't be affected by it in the short term, whereas it's the workers who can be affected. But in America, with like prices rising, those workers will have to spend more money on things, whereas in China they can just say the price of this thing is cheaper, but and take it from somewhere else in the economy. Potentially, at least that's one of the things I've seen said that might happen. The worst violence that I have ever seen.
Yeah, so this story, the worst violence I've ever seen, comes from the perceived rise in violent crime in London over the past 2 months. I don't know if you saw it. Did you see a story in the Times as well that ran on its front cover about that murder rates in London were higher than New York?
Yes, I've seen that, but I've also seen it refuted by BBC Reality Check already. It's very much cherry picking the result because we're only 3 months into the year.
I would also recommend listening to More or Less, the Radio 4 podcast that does a very good deep dive into exactly the same thing about the data that they used. Essentially, they took a very small chunk of data from the past 2 months. And actually, if you look at over like the past 10 years, it's more of a story of success in the New York policing and how much they've been able to bring murders down in the capital rather than the rise in murders in London. There has been a spike in the last 2 months. That's for certain. But now, after we've had the violence, sort of different political sides have taken to the blame game, and different sides are pointing to different reasons for the rise in violence. Lots of people on the left are saying that it's because of cuts to the police, and that's been backed up, I think, today by a leaked Home Office report that essentially said they believed this was the cause. But others on the right have pointed to Sadiq Khan and said that it's because it's a Labour-controlled mayor in London has led to a rise in violent crime. I would tend to go with the Home Office statistics more than the latter explanation. But it's a really interesting example of how kind of almost bad statistics or a bad use of statistics can make a story out of something that might not seem very spectacular on the surface.
Yeah, I think that's something we'd like to do a deep dive on in the future, perhaps. In fact, we have an idea, or I might say this at the end or something, but we have an idea that over the summer, when during silly season, we might do a slightly less episodes, but they might be like deep dives into particular topics that affect, media representation, things like that, other related topics.
Yeah,
and that would fit there, I think.
Mm.
Right, our next headline is Patients Flee NHS Waiting List Hell.
So this is a story from the Daily Express, essentially saying that because of a rise in waiting list times in the NHS, they're seeing more and more people go abroad to seek treatment. Essentially, I think this is a big story, particularly for the Daily Express audience, which does tend to go towards have a more elderly audience, likely to be in hospital more often. So this will appeal to their readers. And it also sort of plays into the Express's fear that the NHS is overworked, that waiting lists are too high, and they want to see a change. I think probably the biggest pressure that Theresa May has had from both left and right is that both sides want to see an increase in NHS funding to help an organisation which is clearly under strain.
Well, we've already alluded to our next one, actually, from what you said about earlier. So this is police cuts likely contributed to rise in violence, leaked Home Office paper says. So this has basically been on BBC News 24. It's the only thing that's been on the TV today, as far as I can tell, because Amber Rudd went out and gave a talk, but she's kind of been undermined by this leak, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, that's essentially the story, and it does link back to the spike in the reason why this report has got so much coverage is because of the perceived spike in violent crime that's happened in London. It's kind of shone a spotlight on the issue. Like I said, it's led to people playing the blame game or looking for a reason why. And this Home Office paper, if true and leaked, and particularly if it's going against the version that the government says, is pretty damning, and it hurts the Conservatives, where they're traditionally seen as strongest. They're meant to be strong and tough on crime.
What was Amber Rudd's proposed solution, being that the left's suggesting more police? What was her suggestion today that she was saying in this speech?
Yeah, so Amber Rudd's response was that it was linked to drugs and rising crime. She said that the illegal drugs market was essentially the biggest driver of the increase, and we should look to portion the blame on drug dealers rather on the police and their stop and search power.
Our next headline, You'll Pay, Trump warns Assad after gas attack.
So yeah, this is the terrible story that came out yesterday of a suspected gas attack in Syria, I think where over 70 civilians were killed. And the big inference is that this has been a chemical attack. If it is a chemical attack, then that would be very severe, because not only obviously are chemical weapons banned under the Geneva Convention, they were also meant to be removed years ago. Do you remember that there was a big vote in the House of Commons, I think when David Cameron was still in charge, about the use of aircraft over Syrian airspace as a response to what they suspect back then was a chemical attack as well. Eventually that was stopped because Russia came in and said, it's okay, we've got Assad to remove all his chemical weapons, so there won't be any trouble now. If this is a chemical attack, then it means that not only Assad, but also Putin might be, Putin, who's supporting Assad, could be seen to have reneged on his promise to get rid of those chemical weapons in Syria. So it's probably the strongest response from Trump and strongest anti-Putin message that Trump has had since his election.
And finally, leading into one of our major news stories for this evening, Corbyn, I will meet Jewish leaders. The headline there was underlined and italicized for emphasis, and that's from the Jewish Telegraph.
This is in a response to this sort of bubbling anti-Semitism row that's been happening in Labour, particularly over the past 2 weeks. But it has been something that's been going on far longer whilst Jeremy Corbyn's been in charge. And it's something I want to go into more depth with later in the podcast. But essentially, this is Jeremy Corbyn fronting up, saying that he will respond to pressure from his own MPs and members of the Jewish community to meet with Jewish leaders to address these concerns of anti-Semitism and try and stamp it out in the Labour Party once and for all, to try and draw a line under this crisis that has threatened his leadership, essentially, of Labour.
It's one of those stories where it's kind of hard to work out where the misinformation lies. You see, or where, what is real information, what is being kind of built up by the media, because Corbyn went and stayed with a Jewish group, right, and for Passover, but they're quite a left group within the Jewish community that is a generally quite traditional community, and so some people saw that as an attack. Or like some people saw that as worrying, but what he was doing was going to a Passover event, which you would consider is good. I mean, frankly, I think he was in a position at that point where whatever he did, people would have, like, if he'd refused to go, people would have said, "Oh, he's anti-Semitic," and if he he went and he still got criticism. But there's a lot going around, and you see, I mean, there clearly is some problem, because I've seen several of my Jewish friends posting various, like screenshots on Facebook groups from various people who are like running as Labour councillors and stuff. And then they're not being like stricken off the list when this kind of stuff is found. And so there's definitely a problem. But I don't know if anyone really knows what the level of the problem is at this point, because it's obviously being played up by some of the media, probably more, but it's not a thing I know enough about to be able to say, oh, it's definitely one way or the other. But it's interesting. I think we'll see this play out over the next few weeks and see where that level is and what's actually going on. And hopefully they will get it all sorted soon, because, I mean, it's obviously a big negative for Labour, but obviously anti-Semitism is wrong. So we want to see that gone.
Yeah, definitely. I think your first point about how this story's been really tough to follow and to kind of negotiate what is opinion from fact and who to trust on these issues and who's saying what, because you have on one side, I would say you've got right wing press, what some might refer to as the mainstream media, but I guess the mainstream media is a bigger bubble than that. But let's keep it simple and say your Daily Mails, your Expresses, people who are biased against Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think that's too strong to say. They generally dislike his leadership, who are jumping on this story because they see it as an attempt to smear Jeremy Corbyn, to put him saying, oh, he's anti-Semitic, therefore he's unelectable, and therefore he's unsuitable to be Labour leader and leader of the country. On the other side, you've got Corbyn supporters on the left who really want to defend their leader. They believe in what Corbyn's done to the Labour Party. They are very passionate about it. And so almost go too far the other way.
Yes. I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
And dismiss the allegations of anti-Semitism as just smears and don't really focus on the problem at hand. And as always, or at least in my opinion, the truth sort of lies somewhere in between the two. If you just want to look at the facts or some of the events that happen, there are troubling things that have happened within the Labour Party, as you mentioned. And I've got a little list here that kind of paints a bit of a timeline of why this story has come up and why it keeps coming up, because it's not the first time in Corbyn's leadership that the threat of anti-Semitism has been thrown at him. Do you remember the first time?
I was going to say, I thought even before this, there was a story about Ken Livingstone, which was before Corbyn was leader, I thought. So it's that there's some kind of, there's even more backstory to it.
Yeah. So back in April 2016, Ken Livingstone had said in a BBC interview that Hitler had originally been a Zionist who supported moving all the Jews to Israel before he went mad and ended up killing 6 million Jews, which was quite a flippant comment about the Holocaust, and also one where he seemed to be calling Zionists, basically making an equivalency with Hitler and Zionist.
Right, yes.
Which greatly offend the Jewish community. And that led to protests, people asking for Ken Livingstone to be thrown out of the Labour Party, and Jeremy Corbyn didn't act on that for quite some time. And that led people to sort of think that Corbyn may have had sympathies towards Ken Livingstone or wasn't treating the problem as seriously as he could have done. There's also another couple of incidents that people point to. So there's also the case of Labour MP Nazim Shah, who compared Israel to Nazi Germany and suggested that the Jews were rallying in defense of Israel. And because of those comments on her Facebook post, she was suspended from the party, but was later reinstated after 3 months. And people felt that that wasn't long enough for her to be suddenly put back into the party. There's also questions about Jeremy himself. So those are two issues where it's not been Jeremy Corbyn, but it's a perceived weakness in his leadership to not act on that quickly enough. Others would say that because Jeremy Corbyn is staunchly pro-Palestinian, which doesn't mean you're anti-Semitic in any way. It just means he supports the Palestinian cause. But some people feel that he's gone too far, and there is a quote that is used by a lot on the right to try and attack Jeremy Corbyn, saying that when he invited members of the terrorist group Hamas and Hezbollah to speak at Parliament, referring to them as his friends, which led some people to imply that Jeremy Corbyn was friends with anti-Semites. So there's a little bit of like needle there, and there's certainly more attack from this anti-Semitic angle by Jeremy Corbyn being in charge of the Labour Party than there would be of any of the other people up for the Labour leadership. So that's why it's become a bit of an Achilles heel, or at least a point where people feel that there might be an issue with Corbyn and anti-Semitism. Do you know why why this latest row around anti-Semitism flared up in the first place?
I think I missed the actual start of it. I then started kind of paying attention once I'd heard it had happened, but I think I missed the very start of it.
So it was about a Facebook comment that Corbyn made back in 2012 about a mural that was...
yes. Yeah, I heard that mentioned, yes. Yep.
Yeah, so that was an anti-Semitic mural that Corbyn basically left a comment on there saying, I don't think it should be... I'm trying to find his exact words maybe to make this fair. Just at least I want to put it in context. So there was a mural back in 2012 that Corbyn had written on the Facebook post to this person saying that he thought it was unfair that it was taken down, and had written, why you're in good company, basically saying that Rockefeller, one of the people who was portrayed on the mural itself, had tried to get a mural moved on his building when it depicted Lenin. That comment on that mural was found by an activist. I think it was Guido Fawkes, but I'm not sure. But anyway, it was brought to the attention of the media, and that's what sparked again this anti-Semitism row, and led to other things coming up. So there was you mentioned a councillor who had been suspended. Essentially, a councillor wasn't suspended because Christine Shawcroft, who was part of the Labour Disputes Council and also head of Momentum, which is the Jeremy Corbyn supporting sort of group within the Labour Party, she declined to remove that councillor from the election because they thought they could win. So that led to her resigning and being replaced by Eddie Izzard. Some said Jeremy Corbyn should have fired her before she even had resigned. That then led to Jewish groups protesting outside of Parliament, many of which were supported by Labour MPs. And it was at that point where the story really got a lot more traction because there was quite a public protest. But since then, Jeremy, like you said, has met with Jewish groups and says he's doing everything to tackle it. I think it's something that he will definitely have to get a hold on if he wants to improve his image amongst the general public. But at no point in this story do I ever think that... The weird thing is that at no point do I think that Jeremy Corbyn is anti-Semitic in any way. But it certainly has highlighted where there's a problem maybe within supporters or within politics of anti-Semitism, and that all mainstream political parties should be doing more to stamp it out and make sure that it's just not part of their discourse.
And I think this is one of those stories where, not being Jewish ourselves, we may, I think it's fair to assume we think that's the thing that's basically gone in the world. I mean, obviously, some people are racist. Some people have these kind of views still. But it's one of those things you kind of feel like, oh, well, that's gone. It's basically not a thing anymore. Yeah. But then suddenly you find out, actually, no, okay. So that's when it suddenly comes into consciousness as well. So not only is it the fact that I think most people would have assumed that anti-Semitism is low in the UK, and then we're finding out actually there's more of it than we thought. Again, not knowing the exact level, but we don't have to face it day to day, and some people do, and obviously that's awful. And then it's also kind of, yeah, I think there's kind of this we tend to feel like we're beyond these kind of things, but then we realize we have a setback when we realize actually no, there's still problems with these kind of things in our country. I think I wonder if maybe in the UK we do tend to think we're better than that, and
Yeah.
I feel like that's the overall kind of feeling, and I think it's the thing we often complain about America, and be like, oh, look at them, they have all these kind of race wars and stuff, but we still have problems. It's not just there's not just anti-Semitism, but there's still racism and stuff like that, and problems going on with that in this country, and it's a thing people like to forget is going on. I think might be true as well, because it obviously it doesn't reflect well on us as a society when we still have that going on.
I think you're right. It's almost quieter. It's almost more invisible here, but that doesn't mean that it's not going on. And now it's being addressed out in the open. Hopefully, the more work that goes to resolving that problem, the better.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we're going to touch back now on a story that we discussed last time, which was 3 weeks ago, and so this has carried on developing, and that is the Russia story with the poisoning of the spy, and then UK sanctions, the EU kind of and America kind of siding with us, which I think we mentioned last time. But how's it developed from there?
Yes, so I think we've started to see more measures put in place by the UK government and the response from Russia. So now we've seen quite a solid response from the UK, freezing of Russian state assets. Us and 28 other countries have expelled 145 Russian officials from their countries. NATO have ordered 10 Russians out of their mission in Belgium. Russians have responded by expelling 23 diplomats and 60 US diplomats as well. Essentially, it's a bit of tit for tat, and shows quite a big meltdown in diplomatic relations between the two countries. There's also been a step up in the information war that's sort of happening between Russia and the UK, and it's a really good. This might be another topic we can deep dive into later during our summer break. But the way that Russia is not using their hard power of their military, but they're also using the soft power of their intelligence forces, Twitter, misinformation, or at least trying to put forward their version of events, and trying to muddy the waters, has seemed to be quite effective in this case. The biggest example I can give of this is, do you remember when Theresa May and Boris Johnson came out and said, this is Russia, this is definitely Russia, we know that they did this attack?
Yes, yeah.
And then
Jeremy Corbyn was criticised for suggesting that maybe it wasn't, and we should wait to double check, essentially, I think was the summary of that. Yep.
Yeah. So whilst this was all going on, a chemical lab in the UK called Porton Down was doing just that. They were waiting and they were checking to see about what they could learn about this Russian nerve agent. And the news came out a couple of weeks ago, I think now, that they weren't able to prove that the nerve agent had come from Russia. This led to people saying that Jeremy Corbyn was sort of right and vindicated in his view. It also led those within Russia to say, aha, this is proof that it's a conspiracy. This whole story of a poisoning is a fabrication by the UK government, and that they may have even had a hand in it themselves. The UK may have tried to poison these Russian citizens in an attempt to frame Russia. The other big thing that happened was that Boris Johnson and the Foreign Office at this time had tweeted out saying that Porton Down had definitely said the nerve agent came from Russia. So
yeah.
So our foreign secretary has a big egg on his face, essentially saying that there's proof there that Boris Johnson lied, or at least misspoke out of turn by saying something that he said was true and it hadn't been in the lab.
Yeah.
The sort of truth, or if you take like a nuanced view to this, it lies in between, because Porton Down had never been asked to prove where this agent came from. So you've got a slightly odd situation where at least the government official and Boris Johnson is saying that we have proof, but they've never been asked to do it in the first place. The other thing that came out from Porton Down was that they said that although the precise source of the nerve agent couldn't be verified, it was very likely to have been deployed by a state actor, which essentially means that they thought it was Russia who was responsible. Russia then accused Britain of sort of like saying that Britain had stitched them up and saying that the state actor wasn't them, but Russia had been denied access to basically an independent inquiry to the source of the nerve agent, because there's fears that Russia, if they were involved in that, then they might use their influence to either delay the inquiry or try and get a result that was more favourable for them.
We have a mixture of stories here. With the government, it would seem like the government and Corbyn, having knocks to their reputation essentially, but also having maybe some positives, depending on how you view the stories. So how do we think that's affected people's opinion of both parties?
Well, a recent YouGov poll has come up that essentially says that the Prime Minister now holds a 10-point net favourability lead over Jeremy Corbyn. And that's for the first time since the general election. So until now, Jeremy Corbyn has been seen as more popular than Theresa May by quite some margin. I think after the election, there was nearly a 40-point gap between May and Corbyn. So to have it turn around in such a short time is quite impressive. And I think these stories have hurt Jeremy Corbyn and helped Theresa May in different ways. So I think it's quite obvious how the anti-Semitism row has hurt Jeremy Corbyn. I think it at least puts his leadership qualities into question about how quickly he's able to react to events within his own party. And the Russia story, because Jeremy, even though some might say that Jeremy Corbyn was seen to be right in his assessment that we should wait to see what the results of the chemical tests were, because his view, or at least how Boris Johnson has put it, that Jeremy Corbyn comes across as a Kremlin stooge, because Jeremy Corbyn's events sort of like help muddy the waters or help the Russian version of events slightly. It does knock, again, Jeremy's perception as a leader and what he might do if he were in charge and Russia was a real threat. By the same token, Theresa May has been quite strong against Russia from the start. She's presented a united front, and if people are rallying to a cause or rallying against Russia, then people will tend to support the person who has the power to stand up. So that's seen May's favourability rise. So it's a little bit worrying, I would say, for Labour at the moment. Not massively, because, as we know, it only takes one general election for people's opinions to change quite wildly. But it's certainly been, since we last came on air, it's been a really tough few weeks for Corbyn and his leadership, and it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here to recover.
And I think it's worth pointing out, there's two things. There's a related article, and there's the graph in this article you sent me from YouGov. So
yeah,
Corbyn is almost back at the point he was at in August 2016. Theresa May is, as we say, 10 points higher, but she is nowhere near where she was for most of the run up to the general election. She still maybe it's hard. This graph doesn't have the best scale on it.
Yeah,
but that's a discussion for another time on the graphs in the media. But you can see that yes, she is up, and the trend is currently that she's going up.
Yeah,
it's not back up to the heights she was at. So it's still people having problems with her. It's just Corbyn has dropped quite a bit in the last 2 months while she's overtaken. And the related article I wanted to mention is this article is from the 9th of April. From the 4th to 5th of April, which is probably within a few days, as a voting intention poll, which puts Conservatives at 42% and Labour at 41%. So it looks like the percentages for the parties are still basically where it was at the general election. Oh
yeah, we've seen very little change within the polling since the general election. It's been amazing to see. Well, before the general election 2017, there was a massive gap between the parties. There were like 20 between the Conservatives and Labour. So Labour under Jeremy Corbyn have done an astounding job to close that gap. Maybe the worrying thing for Labour now is that although they've been able to close that gap, they've really struggled to surpass the Conservatives or get the Conservatives ticking down at all to any significant degree. It might show like far more polarization in the country. There's you used to have about 35 and 40 for another one, and that leaves about 25%, doesn't it, for like third party options. Yeah. Now it just seems that we have two tribes who are quite entrenched, and it's going to take something big to knock any of those sort of like voting intentions numbers down a lot.
Yeah, having read into that article a bit more, I just noticed it said, so this is on a week by week basis, and then, obviously that does matter when there's an election because it happens on one day. But the Conservatives have lost 1% and Labour have gained 2% from the previous week. There isn't a graph for me to see. There isn't a graph that allows me to see what the general trend is. But it's hard to draw a conclusion from 2 points. But it is just that there is still some jockeying going back and forth.
Yes, certainly, and that's the new politics now. The 2017 election really shook up the British political landscape, where they eliminated. We used to be sort of a 2.5 party system. So there would be at least 20% of people there or thereabouts who would vote for a party that wasn't Labour or the Conservatives. Now it's looking like solidly 2-party. These are the titans that are going to go for it. If a general election was called tomorrow, I genuinely wouldn't have an idea of what would go on. I think we'd likely have another hung parliament.
Yeah,
I don't think any side would be able to make a majority in the current circumstances.
And our returning regular feature, Would You Rather?
So this one is maybe a bit more political than the other ones, but I'm trusting you here, Wilco. I think you can do this one.
Yeah.
So what voting system would you rather have for general elections? Would you rather have proportional representation, or would you rather have our current system of first past the post?
I would say it's an easy one for me. I think proportional representation. There is a lot. I've read up a lot on this. When we had the referendum on alternative vote, I was pro alternative vote, and I've not changed my opinion since then. I think there are a lot of problems with first past the post, and I think in general most of the criticisms against it are that they're trying to play on people's fears. So obviously with proportional representation, you would have the fact that there would have been more UKIP members in Parliament. Based on the numbers, but that's also more representative of what there was. And I think people's concern is if that would lend them legitimacy. But I feel that if they'd actually got into government and people had realised that they're not particularly good at what they do, then I mean, it's very hard to kind of do anything. What if would have happened kind of stories with history. But I feel like maybe if some UKIP members had got into government, yes, we'd still have some UKIP members in Parliament. But then I feel maybe the actual Brexit row would have gone differently, and those people would feel like they were enacting change. Maybe less people would have actually voted for breakfast. Less people would have actually voted for Brexit because I think I get the impression that quite a lot of the people voting for Brexit did so out of out of disenfranchisement with the current political system. And that's why we've seen this big change in the political system. So if people had felt they were better represented, maybe, we would still be talking about having a referendum if we had UKIP members in Parliament, obviously, because that's what they want. But I feel the feeling of the average person would be different if they felt they were being well represented. And I think maybe we'd have had some of these discussions that ended up being happening in the referendum might have happened in Parliament in front of everyone, and people would have had more time to analyse these things. And not that there aren't rules when you're campaigning, but there are also rules that hold in the House that mean the debate has to be more civil than it sometimes was. And I think that probably would have been better overall, even though I know that's a criticism. People often go, oh, you would have had this many UKIP MPs. But, that would have been representative of what people actually voted for, which is the whole point.
Yeah.
It comes with highs and lows, as does any political system, but you can't say, taking this, ad absurdum, it's if you go to the absurd, well, then you say, well, I only like this party, so only my party should be able to be voted for, and then you've got a dictatorship. So you're going to have times where people you don't want to be in power are in power. But I think I feel like the problem with having a two-party system is it is inherently polarizing. And I think we've seen that it's, as you say, it's getting more polarizing. They have similar issues in America where they've had a two-party system for as long, well, like my entire lifetime. They've not really ever had a reasonable third-party candidate. So it's amazing how different it feels now from 2010 when we had the coalition coming in, and I'm quite optimistic about what was going to happen there. And I think a lot of people were. And I still feel in retrospect that it was better than a purely conservative government, because at least there was some debate going on, some deals being made that made things more centrist, essentially.
No, that's all right. So you'd be happy with like more coalition deals going on, because that's essentially what proportional representation offers. I think you can see it in like Italy and Germany and Belgium to an extent. Sometimes it can take like years, months to get a government together to form. Would you be happy for that? For that to happen?
Overall, yes, because I feel the system is fairer. I appreciate there are some issues. I mean, Germany took, was it 6 months in the end to form a government in the latest one, and that's because it was very close. Yeah. But I feel the end result of that is a compromise that is better for the average person, because if we can't decide between, like, it's like again with the Brexit referendum, we had a very polar choice, one way or the other. We didn't have a clause saying, well, if it's in the middle, we will go back and like have a discussion about a deal or something. It was very much it was one way or the other. And obviously we can't change how that vote was now, but you could foresee different ways of doing that, saying maybe, well, if 75% of the population say one thing or the other, well, then that's obviously the choice. But if it's, in the small margin that we had, well, maybe we should come to some compromise that's not fully leaving, Yeah. And I think that's the thing. It tends to compromises, and compromises are less polarizing. Everyone loses something in a compromise, but also everyone gains something, as opposed to the opposite. So yeah. I think in general, I feel that is a better way to approach things, especially when you're talking about the direction a country is going in. I don't like the idea of it swinging violently one way or the other.
No, I agree. You see it in many first past the post systems where when one government gets in after a long time out of power, they simply work to undo the work of the previous government, and that takes time and money, and usually is not as helpful as if those two parties were sort of working together towards a greater aim. The other thing would be with proportional representation, if I can bring it up, is that would you be worried about losing your link to your local MP? So in PR, you sort of vote to a national Congress, but you might not have a local MP just to represent your area. Would you be happy to sort of sacrifice that in order to have proportional representation?
So I think this is the thing. This is often presented as a choice of one way or the other. So I still think that proportional representation overall is better.
Yeah.
But I think it is important to have local representation, because otherwise, I mean, we already have the criticism that government is very London focused and very South focused.
Yeah.
But there are ways around it. It's the AV system that was put up in the referendum was not the perfect option. Yeah. But I still think it's better than first past the post. But yes, there are, I can't remember the exact details of them off the top of my head, but I'm sure I can find a video. That there are ways of doing it where you have essentially, so you can have, I mean, you still have local councils, for example. You can change the powers that local councils have, and you can also have, like, essentially you could do something like do away with the House of Lords, and you could have like local representatives go to the House of Lords or something like that, and have a system a bit more like the American system of the two houses, but with the voting being done differently. The exact specifics of I don't have like prepared in front of me, because this is a question you dropped on me this evening. I know there are methods of dealing with that, because obviously it is a concern for people. People care about what's going on in their local community, and that's understandable. I mean, it's part of the problem that people had, with the EU, was that idea that they were not knowing what was going on because it was too far away. And I think it's a question of scope. I think it is more important to me that the country does well, but I am aware that there are local issues that are important too. I mean, I'm sounding very political now, but yeah, like I think it is very important, as you've raised, that we do not forget about local issues that people have, and people do vote strongly about those. But I think I would rather fix the problem with the overall national voting system, first.
You know what? One, I completely agree. I'm with you for proportional. I would rather have proportional representation for nearly all the reasons you've said. So full marks from me in that answer. And secondly, you're right. That last question I gave you, which is a bit of a devil's advocate one. Many countries that have PR do have a second chamber or another system that accounts for local government to be involved or there to be a voice locally. But I would agree entirely that when it comes to sort of like national issues for the states, you probably want a nationally elected proportional representation chamber. And then when it comes to issues that affect people more locally, you can have almost like a separate layer of government or a different way of electing those officials that represent you personally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to get at, but I didn't necessarily have a great description of it in my head. But I knew it wasn't, I know that it's done in other places. And one thing I will do, link in the show notes, there's a series of very good explanatory videos by CGP Grey on YouTube about proportional voting, because I think one of the things that often happen is people, like the example I used with UKIP, is people will think about specific people they don't want in getting in instead, and that muddies the waters of the argument. What you want to look at is, like, you want to take a step back. So basically he did these videos with the animal kingdom, talking about like electing gazelles and lions. So it's not the same. It's an attempt to strip away your political preconceptions that go into the debate and just think about the system and what is fair. And I think that is a very good way of explaining it. I think there's 2 videos he did on the political animal kingdom. So I will put those in the show notes.
Well, that sounds excellent. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Rob, for joining me. And once again, thanks to our listeners for listening to us ramble on about politics. We hope you find it interesting. You can obviously find us at tinkertailorsoldiersponge.com/unparliamentary now. And hopefully all the links still work. I have gone and checked them, but everything has moved over to unparliamentary language, as we mentioned earlier. And we've updated all our other links. You can find us on Reddit is now called unparliamentary language, but it's still /commons people. We might have to go create a new Reddit as well. If you want to support us and what we do, we need money to run the website, and it'd be good to get a proper microphone for Rob, like the one I'm using. So go support us on patreon.com/TTSS. And there'll be a link in the show notes for that. And it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from him.